Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so I'm not going to do an exercise with you, but I am going to just ask all of you to stand up, turn to the person next to you, smile at them, let them know that you're happy to see them. Okay. And all of you at the back there, you people hiding, the youth who said you paid too little money for your tickets, move forward. Move forward. I need you in this conversation. Okay? So now we can all sit down again, except all of you at the back, come forward. Come forward. We don't bite, or at least not on purpose. And someone left this in one of the bathrooms. I don't know who it belongs to, but if anybody recognizes it, knows it belongs to someone, please tell them that we have it here. So come and collect it at some point. So, this afternoon, we're going to have two presentations. We're going to start with Carsten. We're going to have a discussion with the panel. Then we're going to have a short input by myself, presentation, no PowerPoint, and then a short discussion. I want to remind you that we actually have an additional session that's not on the program at 3:15, because we really wanted to make sure that we were being as interactive as possible. So at 3 o'clock, we'll have a short 15-minute break for comfort and movement, etc. Then anyone who's interested, please come back and join us in an open-ended discussion on the issues that we've been discussing so far. Okay? And at the end of this session, I'll make a couple of announcements about the Arts Festival this evening. Actually, Lily will make it, because if you saw how I pronounce the name, it's too embarrassing. So, welcome to this session. I am now going to hand over to Carsten de Dreu, and he's going to actually be talking to us about the biology of care and conflict in groups. Carsten.
Thank you. So I think that in the past 2 days, at the least, we have talked a lot about groups. And at least for me, and not only when we were here, but also when I went back to the hotel and watched the news, groups have not been spoken about in a very positive sense. It looks as if groups are composed of white supremacists who oppose and other groups, other ways of living. It looks as if there are groups of jihadists in Spain that kill tourists. So groups seem to be somehow nasty. And even if we think about this idea of Ubuntu, and we have talked about the aspiration of reaching out and getting this sense of oneness, that all humanity is equal and that we are compassionate for all humans. That seems to be contrary to the idea of that people live and operate in distinct groups. And yet today I'm going to talk about groups, small groups, and I'm going to explore a bit how the way we behave and live in groups and operate in groups and why we are in groups has actually a very foundational, has its foundations in our own biology. And it relates to a lot of the things that we have been talking about this morning. And it relates to things that are not only part of us humans, but also we see that in other species. We see it in other great apes. We see it in voles. We see it in rats. And we're going to explore that a bit today. So if we think about humans living in groups, I think it is important to think about why we are in groups and what are the functionalities of being in groups and why do we want to be in a group. And I think there are many, many reasons. I would like to highlight 3. So the first is that in groups we learn to cooperate with others. We are not born with the ability, the capacity to cooperate. We have to learn that. But it is within the context of a group that we learn to cooperate with others. And by doing so, by cooperating with others within groups, we can achieve much, much more than we could achieve as an individual. This university is the outcome, is the product of a group effort, of many people working together. This dialogue here is the product, the outcome of many, many people working together, cooperating with each other, getting up early in the morning, working a bit later in the evening than strictly necessary, than asked from you. And that kind of self-sacrifice, however little it is, little sacrifices to benefit others, that type of cooperation we learn in small groups, and it brings us very, very far. So cooperation is one very important outcome of group living. The second is that in groups we learn to care for others. We grow up in a family and we learn to care for our siblings, for our parents, and our parents learn to care for us. It is very basic, of course, it goes very fast. And it doesn't seem to take a lot of effort to care for those others within our group. So again, there is this idea of empathy, of caring for others, that is really operating within groups, and it is really, really necessary within groups, and it is where we learn to do that. And we see the benefits of caring for others. Now, there is one other thing that we also do in groups, and that we learn to do in groups, and that is to compete against other groups. Groups do not exist in isolation. Groups exist in a social context, and the social context is composed of other groups within which other people cooperate with each other and care for each other, as we do it within our own group. And to some extent, and at some moments in time, we compete with these other groups. And sometimes we have to, because we're getting into each other's space, and we have to compete for space, for territory, for fresh air, whatever. And sometimes we do this deliberately. We lash out against other groups, and we try to oppress and exploit them. And we have seen many examples of that throughout history. And this is the dark side of operating in groups. And when we, as a group, try to aggress and exploit and suppress people in other groups, we force these other groups to defend themselves. And sometimes both aggression and defense operate simultaneously. It becomes very muddy. But these are 2 very important reasons as to why we in groups aggress each other. Sometimes to exploit and extract resources from the other group to benefit our own group. And sometimes we have to aggress to defend ourselves. Think about a preemptive strike. We may lash out, aggress them to neutralize the threat that they pose to us. And in groups it is these 3 things, cooperating with each other, caring for each other, and then together competing to defend or perhaps to exploit other groups, that I think are at the core of what groups do and what people within groups do. And we can talk about many, many reasons why people cooperate within groups, why they care for others. It may become very automatic, implicit, and it may be very deliberate, conscious. I don't want to go too much into that today. I want to look at the underlying mechanisms, the biology of these 3 things: cooperation, care, and competition between groups. And specifically, I want to highlight a particular biological mechanism, a chemical that is produced in our brain that is called oxytocin. And I will show you today some experiments that suggest that it is this very tiny chemical, this oxytocin, that is heavily involved in cooperation, in care, but also in competition. This is how oxytocin looks like. This is blown up hundreds of times. It's a tiny, tiny chemical. And this chemical is produced in our brain. And here you see the brain, the human brain, and you see this little arrow there, suggested by Yuri. He said you have to put an arrow. So you see where this tiny molecule is actually produced. It's produced in the pituitary and then released into the brain through the hypothalamus. Tiny structures in the brain. And once it is released into the brain, it is basically shipped over to large parts of the brain. As you can see there, it is shipped over, for example, to the central nervous system, large parts of the brain, especially reward center in the brain. And it also is affecting the amygdala. We have heard before the amygdala being a very important part of our brain that is regulating basic emotions, threat, and how to deal with those. So it is shipped over to these parts of the brain, but also to parts of the body. Through the bloodstream, it basically gets to certain parts of the body, and I will show you why that is important. So there has a lot of research with non-human animals looking at what this tiny molecule oxytocin can do, both to the brain and the body. And this research has uncovered two very important functions of oxytocin, and I'll show you here. These are two little voles, and they're a bond. They're a pair bond. They are sticking together, and this is because and regulated through oxytocin. Oxytocin makes you connect to another partner, to your partner. And it makes you recognize that partner, it makes you feel good about that partner. So oxytocin already has a very basic function in getting two animals together, a male and a female together. And then oxytocin also seems to be very important in actually reproduction, in getting offspring and caring for that offspring. And there have been studies with these types of animals where they have been able to knock out the oxytocin system so that these animals do not produce oxytocin. And what you then see is that they do not form this bond. And what you see is that once the oxytocin is gone, they do not care for their offspring that well. So oxytocin seems to be very, very important in, I would say, family life. It is something that seems critical in connecting to other people, or connecting to another partner if you want, and to care for your offspring. Now, from this animal research that did not involve humans, you can perhaps extrapolate and ask the question, how does oxytocin operate in humans? And how does it relate to cooperation and care and partner bonding, maybe care for your offspring? And today I want to tell you about a series of experiments that have been done by myself and my colleagues, both in the Netherlands and elsewhere, that basically show three things. The first thing that I'm going to show you is that oxytocin is very important for care and cooperation. However, that care and cooperation, as modulated by oxytocin, appears to be limited to my own group. It doesn't seem that it involves care and cooperation towards others, those outside of my own group. So oxytocin seems to organize care and cooperation that is bounded to our own group. That's the first thing that I'm going to show you. The second thing is that oxytocin also seems to be involved in aggression, but in a particular form of aggression. That is, it seems to be involved also in aggressively defending our own group against outside threat, enemies included. Oxytocin does not seem to be involved in the tendency to aggress others, to exploit them, to suppress them. So oxytocin seems to create care and cooperation within groups, a defensive protection of your group against outside threat, but not an aggressive tendency to exploit other groups. So how do we do this? There are two main methods to study oxytocin. One is to collect oxytocin from the body, for example, by asking people to drool saliva in a little tube. And you can analyze that saliva, you look for the oxytocin molecules. And the idea is that there are more oxytocin in the body produced, the more oxytocin will be tractable in saliva. And this is an interesting method because now you can look at what happens to the level of oxytocin as a function of what happens in the environment. And one of the things that researchers have found is that when two people get together and they are warm with each other and compassionate with each other, they hug each other, maybe they have sex with each other, lots of oxytocin shows up in their saliva. So our biology responds to what happens in the outside world. If you are nice to me, my oxytocin level go up. So that's one thing that we have found. Oxytocin is a function of being in a group, being nice, being trusted, having loyal people around you, having people around you who defend you, who are nice to you. And then there's another way to study oxytocin, its effects. And this is through a nasal spray, which has oxytocin in it. And what we do in these type of studies is we ask people in our laboratory to come in and to take this nasal spray. We don't tell them what the nasal spray has, what it does. We just don't tell them anything. We just ask them to take this nasal spray. And half of our subjects gets a nasal spray that has this oxytocin in it. And they take it into their nose. Like you see here, my postdoc, Shaul Shelby, he is doubling. And he's actually a rising star, so look at him. And here he takes oxytocin. But the other half of our subjects, we give the exact same nose spray. You cannot tell the difference. But in that particular nose spray, there is no oxytocin. It is a placebo. And nobody knows which subjects get oxytocin or a placebo. The subject doesn't know, the experimenter doesn't know, the only one who knows is me. But I'm sitting high up in my department, in my office, just waiting patiently so that all the subjects have been gone through the experiment, and then we open up the folder and we look who got oxytocin and who got placebo, and then we start to look at what it did to these people. There is two ways. You get saliva, where you can see how oxytocin levels change as a function of what happens around you, how you are treated. Or you can give oxytocin versus a placebo, and that way we can see what the effects are, what is the causal effect of having elevated levels of oxytocin relative to a placebo. Okay. So in the first study, we looked at the possibility that oxytocin is involved in producing and promoting care and care for others. And we had this hypothesis that oxytocin might increase care for everybody. An alternative was that oxytocin increases care for those who are yours, who are seen as part of your in-group. And the reason for this hypothesis is that we grow up in small groups. We are born in groups. We know those people around us. We rely on them. And we perhaps have a biology that allows us to do exactly that. But why would we have a biology that does not discriminate between someone very close to me who I rely on and someone on the other side of the ocean that I don't know? Biology is parsimonious. Biology is, it doesn't ship it over everywhere. It has a function. It has to conserve. So we thought perhaps oxytocin does not only promote care for everybody, it promotes care especially for those in your own group. So how did we study this? We brought people in our laboratory. I'm talking here about 50 people who got an oxytocin spray and 50 people who got a placebo spray, and they didn't know. And then we gave them all kinds of instructions, and it took about 30 minutes. And after these 30 minutes, we showed them a whole series of decision problems. And here you see one, but this is only one example. They did about 6 or 7 of these similar decision problems. And in this decision problem, what happens, we tell them a little story and write a little story underneath, and it basically shows, imagine that you are a lifeguard in a hospital. And all of a sudden you discover that due to a fire, there's deadly gases leaking into the room to the left side, where you see 5 people. And those deadly gases, if they leak into that room, these 5 people will die. Now, fortunately, there is a ladder. And you can climb up the ladder and you can turn off the ventilation system. And if you do so, those 5 people will not die. However, the deadly gases will go into another room, the room to the left. There's only one person there. That person will die. So the dilemma you have here Should I do nothing, I don't do anything, 5 people die. But I can turn off the ventilation system, and then 1 person will die. And some people will say, the greater good is 5 people versus 1, that's easy. And other people say, you should never do something to kill somebody. So this is easy. It's a dilemma. And people solve it in different ways. And we had a little twist here. In one half of our subjects, we told them that if they turn off the ventilation system, the person in the left room will die. The person is called Gerben. And Gerben is a typical Dutch name that is very familiar to our Dutch male subjects. We assumed that they would see them, Gerben, as some sort of an in-group. It's familiar. Another half of our subjects read exactly the same story, but now we told them that if you turn off the ventilation system, the person who dies is called Helmut. And Helmut is a typical German name. And the Dutch do not really like Germans. It's not that we hate them. It's not also because of the Second World War. That's all long forgotten. The problem is that the Germans cheated us out of the World Championship soccer in 1974. And my subjects, who are in their early 20s, weren't alive at that time, maybe just born. But their daddies were. And they keep on telling the story again and again. And we used a little bit, we used the advantage of having the World Championship coming up in a few months from now. At that time, we were under study. And we knew that at that time, all these Dutch guys are geared up. The Germans, this time we will get them. So there is this rivalry. And we assumed that Gerben is in-group and Helmut is out-group. And to be sure that our study was not only about the Dutch versus the Germans, we had a third version. And in this third version, we skipped Helmut, replaced it by an Arab name, Ahmed. And Arab names in the Netherlands, at least at that time, would also evoke the out-group feeling. This is unfamiliar, it's a bit threatening. So we have 2 types of out-groups and 1 in-group. And we have people dosed with oxytocin or a placebo. And the question is, are you going to turn off the ventilation system? Are you sacrificing that 1 person to save 5? Are you sacrificing Helmut or Ahmed or Gerben to sacrifice 5 otherwise unnamed people? And that's the question. And if you care really for others, would you then not turn off the ventilation system, or would you do that? And would you perhaps are more willing to turn off the ventilation system when that would kill Ahmed and Helmut rather than Gerben? And how does oxytocin influence that decision? So that's the key question. Ahmed and Helmut and Gerben may die. And here we see the result. So what you see in this chart is, on the left-hand side, you see on the placebo. So this is people who have their natural levels of oxytocin, nothing elevated here. And what we see is that the willingness to sacrifice the person, to turn off the ventilation system, is pretty high. You know? It's about 4 out of 5 is pretty high. And this makes sense, right? Because you save 5 people. So, okay, we have to sacrifice 1 person. And an important thing here also is we see a little bit higher tendency to sacrifice an out-group member rather than an in-group member. Importantly, statistically, there is no difference between these 2 bars. So you can conclude that under placebo, we are equally likely to sacrifice an out-group compared to an in-group member, under placebo. Now, what happens when people were dosed with oxytocin? Here you see the willingness to sacrifice an out-group member under oxytocin. And you see it goes up. It's a little bit higher, the right hand compared to the left-hand bar, red bar. However, this is not statistically significant. From this, we shall conclude that under oxytocin, people are not more likely to sacrifice out-group members compared to placebo. Oxytocin doesn't make you more or less willing to sacrifice out-group members. Now let's see what happens with Gerben. Gerben is saved. Under oxytocin, there is a significant decrease in the willingness to sacrifice an in-group member to save 5 unknown others. So under oxytocin, the greater good is gone, and we are focusing on the in-group, and we care for our in-group. We do not care more or less about out-groups, but we care more about the in-group, and we are willing to take action. And this is only in one example. As I said, we have shown very many of these dilemmas, and we see it time and time again, this particular pattern. Recently, colleagues in China have replicated this kind of study with different methods. They found the same thing. So it seems that it's not only applying to Helmut and Ahmed and Gerben in the Netherlands. It seems to be also happening in China when Chinese students think about Japanese students who they see as an outgroup. So it seems to reach out across. More recently, but you could argue, okay, our study is very artificial. It's kind of hypothetical. You push a button, that's it. And recently, colleagues in Israel published a study where they looked at the same phenomena, but now in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And they had people, Israeli youth and Palestinian youth, brought into a laboratory and then asked them to go through a series of tasks. And what they did in this study was they did not give oxytocin through a nose spray, but they had people drool saliva and analyze the oxytocin in the saliva. So now we're talking about the natural levels of oxytocin. And they did it before and after the task that people went through. So you can see a change in oxytocin levels in the body as a function of the stimuli that you are exposed to in between. So what did they do? They had basically in this study, they created 4 different situations. They had in-group and out-group. That is an Israeli versus a Palestinian, or the other way around. Or an Israeli with an Israeli, a Palestinian with a Palestinian. So you have an in-group interaction, or you have an out-group, in-group, out-group interaction. And what did they show? They showed these people a whole series of pictures. And as you can see, some of these pictures are pretty neutral. You see a hand and a knife on the table. There's nothing happening there. But then there's another picture to the right, which looks pretty painful. It shows a hand with a knife pointing into it. And of course, this is a picture, this is not for real. But what we know from a lot of other research is that once you see the picture to the right, it's painful, and it triggers some kind of response in us. Ay! Even that picture. You might feel it in your stomach, right? Now, the interesting question here is, would that feeling in your stomach be equally strong when that painful picture is associated with someone from your in-group, in this case an in-group name, or with someone from an out-group, in this case an out-group name? So think about an Israeli who sees this picture being associated with an Israeli having a knife through the hand. That's painful. Is it the same response when that same picture is now associated with a Palestinian youth? That's the question. And from a lot of research, we know that that's actually not the case. We are more responding in our brain and our body to a painful picture associated with an in-group member rather than with an out-group member. And that is what these researchers indeed found again. So here you see a little brain area that is activated. It's a sensory motor area, which basically gives you this motor response to seeing this painful picture relative to the non-painful picture. And this is stronger when it's about an in-group member experiencing this pain compared to an out-group member. So we see that the brain responds. And we have seen this in many other studies. Now, the interesting thing here in this study is that these researchers could relate this brain response, to the amount of oxytocin from their saliva. And this is what you see. In Israeli youth, this in-group bias, this tendency to have stronger empathic response to pain of your in-group member relative to out-group, is very much associated with the oxytocin levels in your saliva. This, in the Israeli youth, is very similar to what we found in our studies that I talked about earlier. In Palestinian youth, we don't see that relationship, and we don't know why. So you can ask me after this, and I won't have the answer. But at least what we see here is across a series of studies, across different methods, across different cultures, if you want, and different types of conflict, we see that oxytocin seems to be related to care, empathic responses towards those of your in-group, and far less even no to those in the out-group. Now, this all is about caring, and I told you that cooperation within groups is a very important outcome of care, but also a very important thing for us to achieve a lot of things. And here the question that we're addressing now is, to what extent is oxytocin also involved in a tendency to really cooperate with others, to give up your own self-interest, to benefit those others, perhaps in your own group, perhaps in the wider universe. And in this particular study, we used a so-called economic game that I will try to very quickly explain to you. We have 6 people coming into our lab, and they're immediately divided in 2 groups of 3. So these are random people selected and then immediately divided, and one we call Team A, and the other we call Team B. And then we tell them every member now has 10 euros, and you can keep those 10 euros, put them in your pocket, and you walk out, it's yours. And this is actually true. However, you can also use those 10 euros to invest. And the investment goes as follows. For every euro that you invest in a within-group pool, in the blue pool, every member of your in-group, yourself included, every member of Team A, gets 50 cents. So 1 euro investment becomes 1.50 euro that is then equally distributed. So if everybody in my group, everybody has 10 euros, we all invested into the blue pot, that means that we walk, each of us, home with 15 euros. That's cool, right? However, you can do also another thing with your euros. You can also invest them in a between-group pool. And if you do that, every member in your own group gets again 50 cents, as before, no change. However, every member in the other group gets punished by 50 cents. That's it. We explained this. Every member of these groups either had received placebo or oxytocin. And the question now is, does oxytocin influence the way we invest our money? Here's what you see happens in the placebo condition. We see that people invest a little bit in this outgroup spite. People punish the outgroup for no reason. There is no reason. So we are a little bit spiteful. And we also invest a little bit of our money in our own in-group. So we're nice to us, and we're a little bit spiteful to them. Let's see what happens when people got oxytocin. For spite, we don't see a difference. They're equally spiteful compared to those who receive placebo. So oxytocin doesn't make you less spiteful. It doesn't make you more spiteful. It doesn't do anything with how we treat the outgroup. And we have seen that earlier, in our earlier studies as well. But if we look at how much they invest in their in-group, we see a huge increase. It almost doubles. So people, when given oxytocin, are very much likely to care for their in-group and to invest in their in-group. Out of pocket, their money that they could take home, no, they invest it in their in-group. They don't use it to hurt others, but also they do not stop hurting others. And I think that's important. Oxytocin seems to really focus you on your in-group, and that's it. So I've shown you 2 things now. Oxytocin promotes this within-group care, cooperation, and it does not influence, increase or decrease the spiteful hurting of outgroups. But as I said at the start of my talk, sometimes aggression, hurting others, is used, even felt necessary, as a tool to protect and defend ourselves. And we have not seen yet whether oxytocin influences that, yes or no. So we used another experimental game, an economic game. It's a very complex game, so I won't bother you with that. Try to explain how we did it. We had 2 groups again, and from each group we took each member and we paired them to each other. So we created diets, and each diet composed of an in-group and an out-group member. And we explained to them that they were now going to play a game in which the outgroup, the other person, could make decisions that would affect your outcomes. And either the outgroup, if they made a competitive decision, if they were competitive with you, it would severely hurt your outcomes and those of your group members. Or it would not so much hurt you and your group members. So the outgroup now is a high threat to you and your group, or it's a low threat. And to protect against that threat, the best thing you could do is to compete yourself. So if I'm really afraid of the other group, the best way to protect myself against the other group is to compete. If I don't care about the other group or the outcomes that I and my group receive, I might even cooperate with them. And here's what we see. Do people use competition to protect against the outgroup? And when we give people placebo, we see that they compete a bit, they protect themselves and their in-group a little bit, but oxytocin doesn't, the threat of the outgroup doesn't really matter. We're sort of equal. If the outgroup threat is low, oxytocin doesn't increase or decrease the amount of competition we display against the outgroup. We do not feel more or less of a need to protect ourselves through aggressive competition. But when the outgroup threat is high, under oxytocin we see that people become very motivated to compete. They become pretty aggressive. And again, this has been subsequently found in other studies, in other labs, in other cultures as well. So under oxytocin, it seems that we are not aggressive to exploit, to spitefully suppress, but under oxytocin we are willing to aggressively defend our own group. I want to end with one recent study, because if we think about biology, we might not only look at humans, but we might also look at our closely related species like chimpanzees. And the biology that we share with chimpanzees, for example, is very substantial. And recently, there has been a study that I think is very important because it again suggests where oxytocin is involved in this care and cooperation within the own group and the competition against other groups. And in this particular picture, what you see is chimpanzees on a so-called border patrol. These are young males that form a coalition that group together, and they go to the border of their territory, and they patrol along the territory, and they might run into another border patrol from the other tribe that is doing exactly the same thing. And this can get very, very violent between these groups of chimpanzees. They really fight each other, they kill each other. And what these researchers did was they had a very smart way of getting from these chimpanzees, from their urine, they're peeing, and they got that, they collected that, and they analyzed the pee for oxytocin. And what they were doing then was to compare two situations. A situation in which the group of chimpanzees was together and affiliating with one another without any border patrol, without any intergroup conflict. So that's an absent group conflict situation. And they looked at the amount of oxytocin there. And what you see is that if a group is together, we see a significant amount of oxytocin in their urine. That's similar to what we would expect based on the research that I've explained to you. Now what they also were able to do is get the urine and the oxytocin in the urine during these border patrols and during these intergroup clashes. And, and what you see is an elevated level of oxytocin. And the explanation here is that under these conditions of violence, interactions, there is a stronger need to affiliate with one another, to cooperate with one another, to shield and protect each other, and that increases oxytocin. So if we take a step back, I think that this type of work that my colleagues and I have been doing over the past years suggests a couple of things. And the first is that we as humans are biologically prepared, oxytocin being an important thing, are biologically prepared to live in groups and to serve our groups, to give up self-interest for the benefit of the group. And oxytocin seems to be very important in that respect. Now, an important implication of this is that serving my own group and making my own group stronger implicitly means that I deprive others not in my group of resources, of respect, of anything that you want. So I create, by serving my own group, I create a distance with other groups. And in those other groups, this may create frustration, envy. This may lead to them bonding together and seeing us as a potential threat. And this may, for them, be a reason to aggress us because we are a threat. We are so nice for each other. And then the only thing that we can do is fight back. So by serving our own group, which we are biologically prepared for, and it has so many good functions, serving our group, we implicitly and indirectly create distance with other groups, and that can create conflict. So the idea here is that conflicts between groups may ultimately be rooted in our biological preparedness to serve our own groups. We're not necessarily hostile to others, but we are good for us, and us is a limited, bounded entity. And the question that really comes out of that is that accepting the fact that we are biologically prepared to serve our groups, that living in groups has so many beautiful things and is so important and gives us so much, can we somehow use this and use our biology for this within-group cooperation in such a way that it does not create this competition and this feeling of envy and distance with other groups, and ultimately, therefore, triggers conflict between groups? I hope we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carsten. I'm going to open this up to the panel. The immediate question that keeps running through my mind is the in-group, out-group, and our definitions, because the bigger the out-group, the smaller the in-group, as it were. What would those dynamics then entail? But before you answer that, let me open it to the group. Okay, so Michael and then Lily.
Okay. Thank you for this very enlightening lecture. I have 3 questions. When you keep talking, maybe I'm wrong, but I keep sensing certain form of biological determinism here. Now, would we then argue that racism is natural? Racist, because of the desire to be the way he is, the oxytocin. Is it then that racism, to be racist, is a natural instinct? That's number 1 question.
Can I answer
secondly,
that? Oh, sorry.
They are linked together.
Oh, they're interlinked. Okay, good.
Okay. What happens when you belong to multi-layered in-groups? No, you belong to multi-layered in-groups. So you're not just one group, but you belong to multi-layered in-groups, that there is transitions and tensions and transitions. You belong to this in-group, you belong to another in-group, and stuff like that, so that there is no distinct separation between one particular group is blood, and this is actually the nature of humanity, that you are son of so-and-so person, you belong to a tennis association, you are Catholic, you are Dutch, you are a biological association, you are this and this, and then you see all these in-group identities conflating each other, replicating different ways. What happens to your oxytocin when you belong to those in-group identities? Which one is superior? That's 1. And then...
that's 2.
Okay, that's 2, sorry. And then, yeah, so this is the issue of biological determinism and on the basis of racism. And then it seems to be that the basis of cooperation is only when the only chance, the only room for cooperation is only when it's possible for me to benefit from or suppressing the other. So actually, even the cooperation is not necessarily cooperation, but from insofar as I can't stand on the shoulder of other, benefit or suppress them. And would you call that cooperation, or is just a continuation of the in-group supremacy sort of thing? So these are the 3 questions I'm trying to understand.
Okay, thank you. So the first question is racism natural? No. Although I sometimes think I think that Germans are not a different race from, say, compared to the Dutch. There is an important thing. The study that I showed where people were less willing to sacrifice Gerben relative to Helmut, we did that deliberately a couple of months before the World Championship was coming up. And that World Championship sort of foreshadows an in-group, out-group distinction we have with Germans. Today, would I replicate that study with Gerben and Helmut? I might not find the findings we found a couple of years ago, because at this very moment, there is no rivalry between the Dutch and the Germans. It's only when the World Championship comes up, you know? So in that sense, yes, group boundaries and which group you feel you belong to is very fluid. And I think Becca's study this morning, where she showed how a hooded rat raised by albino rats takes care of albino rats and not hooded rats. So it is very fluid. Racism is not natural. I think what I found in my studies is that serving your own group is natural. And that brings me to the second question that you have, and that is, who is that group? And I am part of many groups. And I think that's true. However, I think also that this is a relatively recent phenomenon, that we are part of so many different groups. We have for a very long time, and I think in many parts of the world today, people are grounded in one group, their community, their family, extended family, perhaps a work organization that they have more or less lifetime employment. So in many cases, the groups of people will rely on and who rely on us is relatively long-term. So, and then we are part of different groups, and these different groups may be, I would say, become salient. The different group memberships may become salient as a function of what happens in the environment. Like whether the World Championship is coming up, all of a sudden I feel united and bonded with other German guys. But when these other Dutch guys, I should say, I never bond with Germans.
With or without the World Cup.
I should stop about these Germans, but anyway, so. So it is in that sense fluid. At a particular moment in time, I perceive this is the group I rely on and they rely on me, and that is where the oxytocin comes into play. And this can be a group that extends over months or years or perhaps my entire lifetime. It can also be a group that exists for a couple of hours. Like in our experiments, we bring people in and within minutes we can create the sense of group. I'm in team A, they are in team B, and that already can be enough.
But if you say that it's always about protecting my own group, the effort I make is always, I'm trying to see the tension here, because the racist, the white supremacist, can also make a claim, everything I do, everything is about promoting my own self-group in that way. And you say racism is not natural. Couldn't the racist or the white supremacist also make a claim that is also trying to protect his claim? It might be biological racism, might be a different kind of racism. Isn't the same argument applicable? Because the same argument of protecting your own group can be made by a racist. And
Absolutely.
In point of history. So,
I think, yeah. No,
and you say this is my instinct to protect my group, then, sorry guys, but this is who I am. I have to be racist.
But you see, it comes back to what you were actually saying, that we belong to multiple groups. So if you look, for example, at the United States, and you look at the way in which equal rights was introduced, when they had the Declaration of Independence, we believe that all men are created equal. They meant exactly that. They meant all men. They didn't include women in that. They didn't include, and they meant white men. And yet, many Americans will say, we are American. So I think it comes back to your own observation about multiple identities, multiple connections, and that it doesn't have to be biologically determined in any way.
Can I add to that? Because I think, and I said that earlier this morning, and it's still something that I need to do a lot of thinking about. But yes, each group, whatever its ideology, is having members trying to be good for each other within the group. And whether these are white supremacists or leftish liberals or a group of children on a playground, in each of these cases and in all cases, my position is they are trying to do good for each other and help each other out. And oxytocin and perhaps other biological mechanisms are heavily involved there. Now, how you subsequently do that, when you feel under threat, when you feel deprived, when you feel excluded by other groups, there are a range of solutions. One solution is to fight, to aggress. And as His Holiness said, it's a bit outdated strategy, but it's a solution to a problem. And there are many other solutions. One is to pick up the phone and talk. Another one is to vote for a particular party that serves your interests. There are many different solutions to protect the interests of your group and those you care about, not only through aggression. And to be sure, in our experiments, we provide people, thus far, with a very limited set of decision options. They were not allowed to pick up the phone or to get out of their cage because we lock up our subjects, like these little rats. We lock them up and they're not allowed to get out of their cubicle and to walk over across the hallway to that where team B is and say, listen guys, how shall we solve this? They're not allowed to do that. This is, to me, next step. What if we provide a broader solution space, including aggression and more peaceful solutions? When would people
No, Michael, I'm going to move it
Yeah,
on.
for
No. Lily and then Uri.
Lily,
You
your
need
mic.
You need them.
Oh, you didn't get mic'd up.
It's on.
Okay, it's on.
Thank you. I'd forgotten I didn't have that. I was going to say
Now it's off.
Up, to your mouth.
I was going to say that actually, I think I did a bit of coupling with Michael in terms of the questions that came through, because that's exactly what I was thinking about. So maybe I can approach it from this perspective to say that would it help if we somehow worked on, through research and so on a strategy that eventually would enable us to have a group identity, because the problem is, I think, the groupness that needs to be unpacked. A group identity that would not be so amenable to so many of the negative things that come about because we suddenly do not see ourselves as being in the same group anymore. And so it also links up with the practical situation that you are all talking about, where we have group, or rather layers of identities, of group identities, which at some point enable us to band together, but then at other times we sort of do not see that oneness anymore. And I agree that a lot of it has to do with deprivation. When you are deprived, I don't know whether it's a survival thing, and I don't know whether it's biologically determined to then look around and think, okay, who's depriving me? Or how can I get more of that thing? Maybe somebody is denying me access to that thing. And we see that happening, in terms of the economics of it, that even where in situations where we have not necessarily hyped up our tribal identities, but when there is a problem in terms of maybe scarcity of something, we then suddenly go back to our tribal identities and say, I am this, and because I'm this, I deserve this more than that other person. So it's something that even we in our nation states are having problems with, because suddenly we see ourselves as the insiders in others within the same national context, where at other times, in other circumstances, we were seeing ourselves as one, but suddenly there are we are the insiders and then those are outsiders. So I think it's really a very, very good dialogue because we can immediately connect it with the challenges that we are having today. So that's all I wanted to contribute.
Okay, Uri and then Jimpai.
I have a question that a bit confused me. In the study, when you can choose either to invest in your group or to invest in your group, but let the other group pay for it, right? That was my understanding. You have the experiment that either you invest in your group or you invest in your group and you let the other group pay for it.
Yeah.
In my understanding, when you gave them oxytocin, they invested more in their group. So can't you think about investing in your own group in this case is actually being compassion? Because basically you didn't ask the other group to pay for it. So in a way, in this case, oxytocin increased the love for the other group. Is it an interpretation that you can come for the study?
No, I think that's a very good point. So I think that the studies together, if you piece it all together, what they show is that oxytocin as one mechanism to promote cooperation within the group, as long as the other group is sort of not a threat to the own group, not perceived as a threat to the own group, and its survival and its functionality of the own group, then there can be, and that is where I think the biology points to, there can be peaceful coexistence between groups. I don't care much about them, they can do whatever they want, they can take care of themselves, I take care of us, and I think that that is a situation that actually we see a lot of times. So many groups, tribal systems, communities, work organizations, nations, they exist, they coexist. We're not fighting each other all the time. We may have some competition, but that turns into benign trade, where we find ways to do things that are good for us as well as for you. So I don't think that groups are bound, are set to fight each other. The problem emerges when we see the other group as a threat to us. And I think once we get a good understanding of when and why we see other groups as a threat, even if it's an illusion, I think once we understand that, we really have something to work with, that we can look at the tools that we can then use to bring back groups to peacefully coexist and perhaps exchange and trade and benefit each other. But to get there, I think the basis is we can build a wall between groups. And there are governments throughout history that have built walls. And that's a way to make sure that the other group is no longer a threat. That's a solution. But you can think perhaps of other solutions that will diffuse the feeling of threat, and by doing that, you can cater for your own group, as biology helps us doing it, and we can actually get pretty far without violence.
Jim.
So I'll be very brief. I think I intuitively agree with you that biologically we are prepared to serve our own groups. That kind of makes sense, and also the role oxytocin plays. That also makes great sense. My question is, everything seems to hinge on the formation of the group.
Yes.
And Rebecca's example of the hooded rat and the albino rat. So, and thinking about this in the context with the awareness that groups can be very fluid, multiple levels of identifications and so on. So my question is there any scientific study of the mechanisms of group formation? Or is it just, at the human level, grown-up level, a lot of them has to do with perception or a shared experience, or whether you're a member of the same football club or whatever it is. There is a kind of a shared experience and a perception. But at the biological, very, very fundamental level, since it is such a fundamental kind of oxytocin level, is there an understanding of the actual mechanism of formation of groups? So that's one question. And this brings me about the solution, whether we can best hope for is just coexistence, or whether we can actually expand the concept of I and we to embrace the whole of humanity.
Exactly.
And the Buddhist approach really has been to propose the latter solution. And that's why in Buddhist contemplative practice of compassion, it starts with your own loved ones, and then yourself, your loved ones, and then a neutral person that you normally don't care, but you do kind of know, and then a difficult person, that so-called enemy, and then expanding to the whole humanity, so that once you get over this stumbling block of relating with a difficult person, then although you may not think about the whole world all the time, but you have primed yourself so that whatever human interaction you're going to have, you're going to be able to relate to that person at the fundamental human level. It doesn't really matter what that person has done to me or how that person is related to me, because you have changed your perception. So that seems to be, maybe it is too idealistic, but that seems to be the Buddhist solution, that you can expand the circles of concern and get to a point where you can actually prepare yourself so that every encounter is not going to be a threat to you. You will really be able to relate to this other person at the human level. So what do you think biology will have to say to this?
Okay. Excellent questions. Let me try to answer them briefly. The first question is, what do we know about how groups form? I think we know quite a bit about it. It goes very quickly, and it is based roughly on, I would say, 3 principles. One is similarity. I perceive similarity with another person. And the more similarity I perceive, and this can be we speak the same language, we have the same dress code, we have the same odor, relative, and that gives me similarity. And that's one important ingredient. The second is proximity. Those who are closer to me are more likely to be seen as part of my group compared to those who are farther away. And the third one, I think, is very important. It is so-called common fate. Common fate.
Okay.
We share the same fate. If thunder strikes, we are all hurt by it. And there are people who will not be hurt by it because they're in a different location or they have a different makeup, or that also creates, so it's these 3 things. And if there is similarity and proximity and a common fate, that really creates a tight group. It's a type of groups that I have been talking about and studying. You can omit one. You can say there's no common fate, but there is similarity. Then you see some sort of social category. So I do not have a lot of common fate with other Dutch guys who like to watch soccer. The common fate is very small. I mean, their jobs are different, they live in a different neighborhood. But we share similarity, a same hobby. So we are a group, but not a very intense group. And I think that having these 3 ingredients for group formation give us also an answer to your second question. And that is that I can live in a group and cater for my group, and I will do that more and more when the proximity, the similarity, and the common fate are all there. And you take out one of these elements, and I can still see these others as similar, but I'm not depending on them, and they are not depending on me, and it waters down. And then you can have groups of dissimilar others with a different fate, and so on and so forth, peacefully coexisting. I think that is a relatively achievable perspective. Going to this humanity as one group, I think it has to overcome the lack of common fate, the lack of similarity, and the lack of proximity. So that's a big task. Now, at the same time, if you achieve that task, you will solve a lot of problems. And I think that biology, has evolved over thousands, hundreds, thousands of years. We see the same things in voles, in chimpanzees. These are very long time frames. And this biology has set us up for our small group, our little tribe on which we rely entire life. And in our modern times where we can communicate across the globe and fly to other areas in the world, our biology is not yet set up for that. So we need teachings to help us overcome biological boundaries.
Mandasa and then...
Can I have one quick comment?
Okay, very quick, because it should be Mandasa. Okay.
Because it's really related. Basically, I was thinking about what you're saying. It's a beautiful distinction. And I was thinking, we all have the common fate. We're all humans. We all die from climate change. We all have water. So we have common fate. We are all similar because we are all human. And the third one was
proximity.
Proximity, we are living on the same planet. So in a way, you can extend very quickly. And this is something that's happening with globalization, right? That we feel we are all part of the same globe, right? So there is forces in society that push us now to think about people living in London and New York will feel very close to each other, even closer to people that living an hour within the state because of that. So maybe there are forces between us that can make us more closer also on the global level.
No, I totally agree. And I think what I was just saying is that in that sense, our biology may not have been catching up with our sort of very quick changes that we have seen in the last, I would say, 200 years. You can say the last 10 years. So there's a very fast developments, and we're sort of, it's difficult to catch up. And I think that what our studies and that of many others show is that our biology may be lagging behind and being the brake on certain developments. That should not withhold us of continuing to think about how we could reach that and how we could speed that up. And at the same time, yes, I agree that we share a common fate as humans. And at the same time, the common fate that I experience with my Dutch citizens is stronger and of a different kind if there are droughts here in Africa, or if resources are siphoned out of Africa. That doesn't affect the Dutch. It affects people in Africa. It affects people who take out those resources, as long as, the Dutch have been doing that. But nowadays, I'm not so sure. Okay, this is dangerous territory. But you see what I mean. So I think common fate, yes, but at, again, different levels of intensity. And the more intense it is, the more likely I become to cooperate, care.
It requires a lot of practice.
Okay, so Mandasa and then Becca.
Group work is one method of achieving one noble goal.
One?
We can work in groups or individually or as a community, as a nation, to achieve one thing, being of service to all creation. Mm-hmm. Not to be of service to my club, to my organization that needs protection. I always say to people, the best political leader, religious leader, business leader, is that one who doesn't need to be escorted by security guards. Mm-hmm. If you see such a political leader being escorted, all is not well in the society. Mm-hmm. There is protection for your group that you are talking about. Protect our members. Let us go to nature, where biology is. I'm seeing in my vision right now a big tree. There are different groups that make that big tree. We have the leaves community. We have the branches community, the bark of the tree community, the roots community. They are serving one big tree of life. Mm-hmm. So if your group work is going to achieve that message we are being taught by Mother Nature herself, then thumbs up.
But that's the peaceful coexistence.
Yeah, so please, when we talk or we share these subjects with the people, we are not done yet. Work continues. there is a lot more to discover. So when people give their ideas about our presentations, they want us to go deeper and become richer. And we share the best information with the people. This is the kind of a group method I would look for, the group displayed by the big tree of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandasa. Becca.
Okay. It's hard to follow that comment with I mean, I kind of wanted to bring it back to the laboratory a little bit. I'm very curious about oxytocin, and can it be used as a predictor for how individuals are going to respond to the situations that you create in the lab? So if you, for example, took a saliva swab from everyone the moment they walked in the door of the laboratory and measured their oxytocin, can you predict how they're going to respond, for example, in the hospital dilemma? Are there people who, because of their natural variations in the levels of oxytocin, does that determine how sort of tied to their in-group they feel and how willing they are to sacrifice that out-group person?
I think this is a very good question, and I don't think we can yet. So at the individual level, there is a huge variation in oxytocin. The amount of oxytocin that we see in saliva is really just huge individual differences there. So despite that, scientists have been able to see elevated levels or reduced levels depending on what happens in their social environment. So we see some things changing. I think that to get at the things that you want, we get your saliva, analyze oxytocin, and then predict how you will behave. From our work and that of others, you in principle should be able. But I don't think the techniques are there yet to get such a fine-grained analysis of oxytocin from your saliva that really responds that or relates that well to the oxytocin in your brain to do that now. It's too noisy. So what we have here in that sense is it is suggestive that oxytocin is involved. But I find it very important to emphasize I don't want to get the message out that everything hinges on oxytocin. I would like to get the message out that biology and our biological systems, how our brain functions, the chemicals in our brain and in our body are involved, respond to the environment, and are subsequently involved in how we respond and how we behave, including to our own close kin, our enemies, what have you. Oxytocin being, in that sense, an illustration, but it's a very complex biology in the long run. So we have isolated one thing, but there are many other things definitely involved that may even counteract one another. So.
Okay, one very quick interjection by Michael, because I know we could talk for a long time on this, but we can't. So,
yeah. I wanted to find out, could we then locate altruism and compassion, which is a core aspect of Botho, compassion and altruism, moving beyond even my own group. Could we locate it in maybe common faith? Is that where we could put it there? Is it possible to move beyond the in-group and have compassion and become altruistic even to those that outside my own group? That's just what I wanted to follow up before.
Yeah.
You're allowed to say, I don't know.
I'm not yet ready to say I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know.
Okay. So, can I say, I think we'll come back to many of these things, and interestingly, some of the things that you've been talking about link to some of the questions I want to ask when we're looking at issues of women and children's rights. But so we will come back to this, and I know there are many of you in the audience really wanting to ask questions. We will have time for that. But first, if we can say a really big thank you to Carsten. Thank you.
Hello again, everyone. I'm now in the role of moderator for my co-moderator here. So she's going to present to us the topic, the role of Botho, Ubuntu in modern responses to children's and women's rights issues in Africa. So obviously she's going to be talking about it from a practitioner's perspective. And she's not going to be using PowerPoint, and she's going to be presenting this in the form of really experiential stories from her work that she does in Ghana. In Ghana.
No, across the continent.
Across the continent, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, first of all, Lily's right, I am not a scientist. And so, even though I think I will link into many of the discussions that we have already had, this is much more about experiential storytelling. I'm going back to an African tradition. And wanting really to talk about the crisis that we have been having on our continent in terms of women's rights, in terms of child rights, and in terms of our responses to some of those crises, and how that links into a continent where we have prioritized Botho Ubuntu for generations. What are the implications and why? So I really wanted to pose a series of questions to all of us, to us as presenters on this issue, to you as people who have worked in various situations. Because I'm talking about Africa, but I actually think this crisis around respect and dignity for women and for children is something that is a global issue, and that you can see it in every continent that you go to. So I wanted to start out by giving a quote. I was at a conference about a year ago, and there was a young man there from Zimbabwe. He must have been 22, and he was speaking actually about the environment, and someone asked him a question around the levels of violence there are on our continent against women, and about the role of men in the perpetuation of that violence or in response to that violence. And what he said, which I think was one of the wisest things and very profound things I've heard for a long time, he said, "I do not need the submission or the oppression of a woman or of another human being to make me know that I am a man." And I just thought that with that single statement, he really tore apart the crux of some of these issues that we're dealing with. But I actually want to take it further because for me, when we speak about women's rights, when we speak about child rights, I think it's really important for us to take it away from the individual. Because when we start looking at individuals, then we start blaming this particular man or that particular man or for the oppression and the discrimination against women. And it isn't like that. There are many, many very good men in our world. I think what we have to do, and linking back to what Mandaza had said much earlier yesterday, we need to look at the systems that we're operating in. And we need to understand that when we talk about patriarchal systems, we're talking about systems that we have established which give certain types of power relationships, which means that you do not have to be an evil man to benefit from a system that actually holds women back. You don't actually have to be a vulnerable woman to be discriminated against within that system, because we're talking about systems and we're talking about power relations. And that means that I, as a feminist, and let me tell you, I am very proudly feminist, no ifs, no buts. As a feminist, I do not see Michael as an enemy. The enemy is a system, and Michael actually is an ally in creating a system on our continent and on our earth that promotes equality for all of us. Okay, so some of the things I see in my work, those are the things that have really promoted that way of thinking for me. So when we were talking earlier about multiple identities, I have had people say to me, oh, you can't be African and a feminist. And it's like, really? Who says you can't be Christian and a socialist? Why? This thing of people trying to impose boxes on us, I think is one of the dangers, and it's one of the things that we really have to push out against. Because I actually think, and this goes a little back to what you were saying, Carsten, it's that identification of what is our group, what is our in-group. And I was really blessed to have worked with Wangari Maathai for a while. And one of the things that she taught me was that our in-group, it's not just all of humanity, it's also all of our physical earth. She talked about a three-legged stool, and that three-legged stool was grounded in our ecology, in our humanness, but then in what Jimpa, you referred to earlier, that regulation of our caring and our love for each other into a codification of human rights, and that we needed to integrate those things if we were ever to have a world where we protected our earth, where we protected individuals within the human race, and in which we developed into a caring kind of world. So I think that that whole area of how we stop people manipulating us into thinking that our in-group is only people who either look like us, or think like us, or speak like us, that is really at the core of how we integrate Botho Ubuntu into women and children's rights. And I wanted to tell a few stories about some of the examples that I've seen, because I think we're really good as a human race. Actually, I don't think that good is the right word. We're all too ready as a human race to talk about what doesn't work and what hasn't worked for us. And yet, even in the worst situations, I have seen human beings practicing Ubuntu in the worst of situations. So whether it's the Haiti situation several years ago, where the whole world watches Haiti was battered and suffered and couldn't respond, I found people in South Africa, in Ghana, in Kenya, in Tanzania, who had nothing, but they made themselves part of Africa for Haiti. They gave what they didn't have in order that people who they had never seen and would never seen and didn't actually look very much like them in lots of ways, so that they could help and recover. I gave an example yesterday of grandmothers in Africa, in East and Southern Africa particularly, during the HIV/AIDS crisis, stepping up and adopting multiple children, not just their own grandchildren, not just the children of their neighbors, but children from other villages that they had never even been to before, children that were wandering because they had lost their parents, because a whole generation of parents was lost during the worst of the HIV/AIDS crisis. They didn't do that for money. They didn't get any money. They were actually giving out of the little that they had, and in some cases that little was virtually nothing. But they took on that responsibility because their sense was that they could not thrive, they could not be if children of any kind were actually suffering from a lack of parenting, from a lack of love, from a lack of inclusion. Nobody said to them, "You are practicing Ubuntu." They themselves were looking at the traditions that they had been taught, the traditions that they had lived with, and they applied it to a modern situation. And I think we see that a lot on the continent in different ways. I think we need to learn to celebrate it a bit more, because those grandmothers, people talk about philanthropy and they talk about Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, and if you're lucky, Aliko Dangote. Tell me that those grandmothers were not the ultimate philanthropists. And in a different example, again, of women practicing Ubuntu, I was speaking to someone yesterday about the Liberian Civil War and the women peace activists who came together and, at the end of the day, forced the Liberian warlords, and in some cases really physically locked them in a room, forced the Liberian warlords to come together to talk to each other. And these were women from different clans, from different parts of Liberia, from different economic, wealthy women, poor women, different geographies. But they had seen their country torn apart and decided that as a movement, they were going to come together and help their country heal. And the first step was getting the warlords to speak to each other. They went as far as traveling to Ghana when the peace negotiations began, because ironically, when peace negotiations usually begin, they get the same people who caused the war to come to talk about how you stop it. And the women went and sat outside those peace negotiations until they let them in to say, we want different questions. We want different ways of being in our countries. Again, these women didn't go out and say, we are practicing Ubuntu. We know that our country cannot recover, that our country cannot heal unless we are working together and working together in different ways and allowing ourselves to recognize the humanity even in those people who have committed incredibly inhumane acts towards us during this civil war. But that's what they were doing. They looked at traditions, they looked at current situations, and they then went forward and said, this is how we are going to deal with this. And then just the last example that I wanted to touch on, before I move us to the question about, so the question I really want us to think about is, how is it that we can sit and talk about Botho Ubuntu and the positives of it, when at the same time we're sitting on a continent where in the DRC, the levels of violence against women are beyond despicable. It is horrifying. But it is not only just our countries in conflict. We look at the levels of violence against women in South Africa. We look at people in Kenya wanting to tell women that we will beat you if you wear a skirt above a certain height. We look at children being forced into marriage at 10, 11, 12, 13, on a continent where we have a tradition of protecting children. So what is it that means that grandmothers in Uganda can link with grandmothers in other parts of the continent to find ways to care for our children, and yet other people in those same countries are involved in violating the rights of children? Why is it that we practice Ubuntu in certain areas and then we choose to ignore it in others? What are the motivations? And so before I ask us to look at that question, I was told a story a while ago that really made me wonder about our perceptions of reality and of situations and the extent to which that triggers our compassion or enables us to hide. So the story was told to me by Lima Bowie, who is one of our African Nobel Peace Prize winners. And she won the Peace Prize for the work that she did as part of the Liberian women's movement in establishing peace in Liberia. And she's now part of the Nobel Women's Initiative. And they decided to show solidarity with the women in the DRC by taking a group of journalists, international journalists, to the Congo to talk to the women about their experiences and to look at how things might change. And she said that they started talking to a group of women, and the first woman stood up. And she told a heartbreaking story, you know, that she had been multiply raped. She'd watched her children die. Her house had been set on fire. She had lost everything that she had ever worked towards. Her community had been destroyed. And Lima said that at the stage at which she thought, I cannot hear another word from this woman because this is so awful to listen to someone whose whole life had been torn apart because of other people's greed. And when she said she couldn't listen to another word, the woman turned around and said, and then the women came, and they spoke to me, and they held me, and they comforted me, and they helped me put my life back together again, and they helped me feel like a human being again. And Lima thought, oh, thank God. And then they spoke to the next woman. And again, a horrendous story of pain and anguish. And then at a certain point she said, and then the women came. And they helped me restore my farm. And they helped me find my missing children. And they helped me recover. She said 4, 5, 6 women, all talking, all saying these terrible stories, and then saying, and then the women came. And at the end of it, she thought, actually, even in the worst pain, there is redemption. And they opened the floor up to the journalists, and the first journalist stood up and said, how many times did you say you got raped? And then the next journalist stood up and said, and how many of them burnt down your village? And after the third one, Lima stood up and said, what were you listening to? Why are you asking them about things you already know, about the destruction and the pain? Why aren't you asking them about the women that supported them? Why aren't you asking them about how they recovered? Why aren't you asking them about the strength that they found in sisterhood and motherhood, which enabled them to rebuild their lives? And so when she was talking to me about this, what I was thinking about was, what is it about the way we tell our stories? What is it about the way in which we don't recognize our strengths? What is it about the ways in which somewhere along the way we've started thinking that the only legitimate wisdom is academic wisdom, that the only legitimate ways forward are ways that don't involve embracing each other, and that somehow caring about each other, loving each other, is some kind of a weakness instead of actually being our core strength. And so, Reverend, yesterday when you spoke about surrounding ourselves with circles of love that included everyone and excluded no one, apart from the fact that you made me very happy, to me, that is where we need to start looking at our in-group, out-group thing. Because every time we create those circles and we push other people out, for whatever reason it is, then actually it's not even a positive circle that we have developed. How can we say that we're loving the people inside of our circle if we're showing hatred to the people outside of our circle? So my question to my fellow panelists is, you are scientists and spiritualists and naturalists and social scientists. How do we recreate, because I don't want us to say we're going back to some mythical place 200 years ago that we don't know and would never recognize. But what I do want to ask is, how do we move forward? What do we need to do to make sure that we grow more Liberian women's peace movements, that we encourage the actions of thousands more grandmothers who give and care and surround our children in love? How do we use the concept and the principles of Botho Ubuntu to actually build the Africa that we want to see, to build the world that we want to see, in which we actually, in talking about women and children's rights, in talking about codified human rights, are actually talking about the equality and well-being of all human beings, but also of our Mother Earth. So those are my questions. Yes? Lily's telling me she's opting out of the moderation. No?
I think she's doing well moderating herself. So I'll go on to the other side. And okay, what immediately comes to my mind, and you've really, really shared very, very profoundly inspirational stories. Inspirational because even though, you know, there is a bit of it that is really sad and all that, I want to latch on to what you said about not concentrating on the negative. I think they are inspirational because I think they are sort of motivating us now to reflect on the systems that you talked about and to find a way, or maybe to start thinking about ways in which we could have inclusive, consultative, and even collaborative social, economic, and political systems through which we would be able to recognize firstly that all of these systems, or in all of these systems, we really have the same destiny because we are located together within this framework where we have to work out how we strategize for our future. So, and when we do that, we would be doing, or even perhaps emulating something that in our African traditional philosophy we had, where the Khosi, the chief, if you like, was in many of his roles. He had many, but within those, he had one particular one that really helped with the sustenance of the society for the longer term. And that is the one where there was a common contribution that was made during harvest time to the granaries that were located at the chief's home. Basically, that home was not individually the chief's. It was a communal home for the whole society. And when they had contributed like that, when times became tough and there was scarcity, maybe there was famine, everybody had equal opportunity to get something from the granaries to which they had all contributed in their various capabilities. So I'm thinking that if we can learn something from that in terms of the way in which our leaders, perhaps the leadership, at various levels, the national leaderships and the local leaderships could learn something from that. And when we formulate strategies, firstly policies, and then practical implementation strategies that are inclusive, consultative, and collaborative, I think we can achieve something that would help us towards this goal of flourishing, because it will also, in its inclusiveness, take care of even the gender issues and other types of divisions that we would otherwise have in the society, because they would be inclusive, consultative, and collaborative. Thank you.
You're moderating the others.
Take a microphone.
That I'm actually the moderator.
No, you speak.
You do.
I've forgotten that I'm the moderator. Forgive me. Can I have interjections from the other members of
Hold the microphone.
the panel up here? No, honestly, I'm not used to this thing. Please forgive me. It's really making me uncomfortable. Carsten, you want to say something?
Sure.
Yes.
Well, Theo, thank you for, I think, some very profound stories and insights. And I think that, at least to me, it sets me to rethink or think again about what happens post-conflict and how societies and groups that have been fighting and aggressing each other and inflicted so much harm on each other, and whether that's asymmetrical or not, how you can reconcile, how you can forgive, how you can heal. And I think that we know, as a scientist, we don't know that much about it. And I think your examples, your narrative is very stimulating, and I think we should invest more in understanding that. And then, of course, one way is to think about preventing conflict in the first place, because then there is no
Absolutely.
need to heal.
Yes, exactly.
Okay? And there is one thing that sort of, we have touched on that, I think, also during my presentation and earlier these days. Why do groups start to fight? Why does it, and that's, oxytocin, or this may all be involved, but ultimately, why do groups build walls? Why do groups see the other as a threat that you need to defend against? Why do groups see the other as a resource rather than a group of humans like us? And one of the things, and again, I think science needs to do a lot there, is to think about the ultimate needs that groups have and the ultimate reasons why people get together in groups, and why they help out each other and what they want to achieve at a very basic level. And I think it gets to some very basic needs. We want to survive and we want to prosper. And as a group, we can do better than as an individual. And the problem is that to survive and prosper at some point, we cannot be both in the same location, because that location is not providing enough for both. And then the common fate of us and them becomes a zero-sum game. The more we get, the better we do, the less they have, and therefore there is a problem. And one of the things that I think we should really start to talk about and think about is that there are resources needed for groups to live and groups to prosper. And if resources go down, for whatever reason, then the likelihood of conflict between groups comes up. And then ultimately that requires healing and reconciliation. And I think that is the chain of events that we really should start to think about. And if we get resources out and ship them over to other parts of the world, they cannot be used for groups here. And then these groups need to fight each other to survive.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you so much for the very inspiring presentation, and particularly sharing the story of how grandmothers have played a powerful role in mediating in conflicts when men go crazy. The paradox that you raised really struck a deep chord in me. The fact that on the one hand, on the African continent, you have this beautiful philosophy of Ubuntu that has been talked about, that's also in Proverbs, which means it's actually quite widespread. It's not just an elite philosophy, which sometimes could be the case, but the fact that it permeates everyday proverbs means it is a really an important part of everyday life. But then on the other hand, you do have this reality of all sorts of violations and cruelty against women and children. We see the similar kind of paradox, for example, in the Buddhist world right now, Burma, which is a majority Buddhist country, and there are atrocities committed against the Muslim minorities, including even by some monastic members. And I've always been puzzled by this. And on the other hand, I shouldn't be too surprised, because just because there is a beautiful teaching doesn't mean the teaching gets translated on the field. The gap between the beautiful teaching and the actual reality is a huge one. And I think that is not just an African unique situation. I think it's a situation everywhere. Now, where the African situation is a little more different is that although with all the modernization compared to the modern West, Africa is still very traditional society. And here I'm thinking of my own traditional Tibetan society, and I've always looked at the role of tradition and culture and tradition can be beautiful. It gives cohesion, it gives meaning, it gives a sense of belonging. But culture and tradition can also be very oppressive.
Yes.
And I've seen this in my own father's mentality. I was fortunate to be able to join the monk at a very young age. I was a member of a monastery at the age of 11. So by the time I left, I was in my 30s, so my adulthood, my entire childhood, I never had an experience of being part of a lay family. I had a monastic family. So I was never really made vulnerable to the sensibilities of a traditional culture in the lay culture. But my father did become a monk. But because he had been a family man and all the rest, he remained always vulnerable to this pressure. If I do this, for example, if I turned up in a particular way, he would scold me by saying, "What would other people think?" And that worry of what would they say seems to be one of the most oppressive forces in the traditional culture. So you speak of the systemic problem, structure, and the power relation. Many of the men, as you pointed out, they're actually good men, but they're part of a system. And the system has this social and cultural pressure where sometimes if they don't behave in a particular way, their manhood is challenged.
Yes.
And people are individually vulnerable to that. And how can we get out of this? And here I was just recently thinking of a story. There's a beautiful story I would encourage everybody. I don't remember the name of it's an Indian movie, the story of a father who was a boxer, a wrestler, and wanted a son who would succeed, but ended up having 2 girls. And then he trains them, and then in a traditional society, it was a scandal. It was at every step of the way, it was a struggle. But then she wins, one of the daughters wins an international medal. Now the whole area wants their daughters to be wrestlers. And that one act, a defiant act on the part of one father, which has completely changed social taboo. So I think those are the moments. Those are the saving graces that we need to look at in the traditional culture, because tradition is beautiful, but it can also be oppressive.
And I really agree with you, because I was thinking about this and about the way that actually culture and tradition have to both integrate but grow and move. So I was speaking not long ago to a woman from Kenya who was telling me about this tradition of wife inheritance in Kenya, which is actually just turned into multiple sexual abuse against women. And it was horrible what she was saying. And she was so angry, she had completely thrown away any idea of any tradition being positive. And I was trying to talk to her because it is horrible, and actually it's criminal what is being done there. But I come from a patriarchal family. Well, actually, my mother's from a matrilineal family. My father's patriarchal, so it was an interesting marriage. But my father's side of the family, very, very patriarchal, has the same tradition of what the Kenyans call wife inheritance. But in his clan, it is not a physical inheritance, and the children are inherited, but it is not a physical inheritance. What it is the tradition, which is that no family, no child should ever be left alone. So when my father died, my siblings and myself were given to one of our uncles. The idea was, if there are any issues, if there are any problems, anything else, he is now the father figure in our lives. The same thing with my mother. My mother was given, but not in any physical way. There was no movement of houses or anything else. But the understanding within the clan was that if there was ever an issue, if there was something that she needed, if we were misbehaving and needed to be corrected or whatever, she had someone in the clan who she went to first. So the tradition has been maintained of communal responsibility without this physical abuse, which was what was happening in parts of Kenya. So I absolutely agree with you. Tradition can be so oppressive, and yet it can be so liberating. And I think it becomes more oppressive when people don't understand that our cultures adapt. And if a culture doesn't adapt, it will die, or it will lose all of the people that it's meant to be working with.
True. Thank you.
Yeah. This is a very sensitive story you are sharing, very from different angles, so to speak. In African culture, we say it takes the whole village to raise a child.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
If we are seeing the abuse of children's rights, women's rights, as a family, as a community, don't you think there is a weakness on our part? So what is your women's group doing to look at that and see how it can be put right? It is this problem must be a community problem, a village problem, the problem of a nation. But it looks like we're leaving it in the hands of women alone. We need to see more men joining hands with women to fight for their children and their wives. Men are just observing and saying, that's women's problem. We are not yet together. We cannot call that a family. Because in a family, your problem is my problem, is my wife. And my wife's problem is my own problem. The child is a gift from God. The child belongs to both of us. So one guy stands for the protection of the child. Please, women and men, let's come together on this issue. Let us also look, Mama, at the main cause of the abuse of children and women's rights. There are deep causes here, created and established by some of us humans for a reason that I want you women to go and investigate. It was purposely done, if I may say, to create cheap employment, cheap labor. When we send these kids to go and fight a war, They don't even know what war is. But they are planted with bombs in their bodies to go and hit, so that after you kill so many enemies, you will go to heaven. Let us look at all those causes and see how we can bring healing here. This area needs healing, my dear. It must be urgent. There are laws that have been created and established to protect the abuse of women and children. Are those laws that are in existence binding? Are they being observed? No. If they are not being observed, what are we doing as a village? As a village, as a community, what are we doing? And this is again another point where you see us being very blinded. I'm not saying being blinded by this race or that race. We are being blinded by the system that exists, wherever it may have come from. People, please, can you do more investigations?
But I think you're absolutely right that if we don't do this together, we don't actually heal. And in the same way that these systems that we've set up, and I agree with you, people did this deliberately. At some point, there are decisions made about who would hold power and who would not hold power, and what that would mean in everyday life. And it's corrupted relationships, not just between men and women, but between all kinds of other groups in terms of power relations that we have. And that means that we all have to change. We all have to work together. Because in the same way that some of this discrimination and oppression is so violently horrendous in women and children's lives, I actually think that also much of this there's a virulent masculinity that makes men suffer because it is not natural and is not the way that we need to be if we work together. And we're out of balance, we're out of sync. And so I really do think the legislation is so important, but how can you have legislation and have a government minister who publicly assaults a woman and that minister is still in position and in power? It doesn't work. So the laws are important, and we've done, I think, quite a good job in pushing for more laws and codifying laws, but we still have got to do this change in our hearts, our minds, our spirits, and that's a responsibility for all of us that we have to take.
I think you can wrap it up because it is, after all, your session.
Okay. Okay, so, that's how. Okay, so that's how I'm going to wrap it up. Time up? No. Thank you all for I really mean the questions. I really feel that the more we work together, the more able we are to tackle these issues from different standpoints. And I truly believe that when we get the equality issue right, when we truly believe that our in-group is humanity, then we will have, systems, we will have women's rights and child rights, and basically we will have our rights protected as humanity and as the earth, and that would be a way forward. And so I know that people have questions because you didn't have a chance to ask Carsten questions. We're going to actually take a break now and come back at 3:15 and open this up. All of us will be here. And thank you all very much. And we're all going to go out, I hope, if they've got the music ready, to Pata Pata, because Mother Africa, she's Mama Africa, Miriam Makeba. Thank you all very much. Okay, thank you. So This is going to be very informal, hopefully very interactive. We're all here, and I recognize the fact that people didn't have a chance to ask Carsten questions, but you can talk to us about anything that's happened so far. So I'm actually, whoa, loads of hands.
Look at that.
I'm actually going to start first actually with Reverend Hambira and ask him to make the first comment. So is there a mic that can come to the front? And then put your hands up. So then can the people with the mics go to the back there and another mic over there? So, yeah.
I'm really just trying to briefly deal with the question of where do we see Botho in the Tswana community today, in the Tswana society today. Now I want to start that by bringing back to your minds the quotation that started one of the presentations earlier today. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. And then in the Western world, that would immediately be given a name, a personality, a Plato, an Aristotle, a Descartes, a philosopher, a Mills, or so and so. So in the Western world, philosophical theories and thoughts are ascribed to individuals. In Africa and in Botswana, they are owned by community. And that's where we see Botho. Botho is not a theory that we can attach anybody's name to. No clever scientist or philosopher sat in his study and came up with this wonderful concept. It represents the body corporate. It represents community. And therefore, I think that's the starting point of our thinking about Botho, that a song, a poem, a prayer, that wisdom is never limited to an individual, because if you can sing a song and the rest of the community cannot jive to it, then it's not a song. If you can give a beautiful poem in Africa and people cannot ululate to receive it, then it's not a poem. It is a poem to the extent to which what you are saying is able to strike a chord in my heart and in my life. And that's Africa. I think that's where, maybe African philosophical thinking differs from philosophical thinking elsewhere in the world, that by its nature, it's communal philosophy. It's philosophy that it's big enough that only the community can own. But where do we see Botho in everyday society? And I start from my role as a church minister who has to do funerals and weddings almost every week. We do not have local authorities that are digging graves in this community. And nobody is ever challenged to everybody. Every young man in society knows that I have to be out there in the morning to dig a grave, even of a person I do not know, I have never met, so that they can be given a decent funeral. Because Botswana isn't it? What you do to this hand will do to you. If you use this hand to oil this one, and at the same time this hand is oiling the other. So what you are doing to the other person, you are expecting it to be reciprocated by the rest of the society when the need comes in you. So a wildfire breaks out. Every able-bodied person in the village rises up to go and put out the fire, because it affects the community, treasure and resources of the community. I was asked one time when I was working with the Botswana Harvard AIDS Institute vaccine research, Reverend Hambira, why do you think young Botswana will volunteer for vaccine trials? And I retorted the question by saying, why do you think they respond to the call to join the army or the police force? Same reasons that they will use to protect the nation, to protect the welfare of the society, to make sure that our society is safe in the long term. That same reason will be the reason why a young Botswana person will see every reason on earth to volunteer for a vaccine trial, even of a product they do not know, because they know that in the ultimate, in the long term, it will help the society, not just here, but global society, wherever mankind and humankind is found. So yes, I think I want to say, African governments talk a lot about Botho, but they do very little about it. Because African governments, the biggest disadvantage of African governments is that they want to mimic Western governments. So a government will always have an attorney general, a lawyer as its advisor, instead of also not thinking of having an anthropologist sitting next to the president and saying, humanly speaking, we cannot say this, or we cannot do this, or we cannot go there. This is sacred ground. I know you want to build a school here, but these people are saying this is an ancestral graveyard, so we cannot decimate the graves to build a school. The graves are as important a place of learning for African child as the school is. So I wish and I pray that African governments would consider the importance of Botho, the way they consider I mean, basically, if you are looking up anywhere in Africa today, you'll find scholarships for science, for mathematics, for history, for this. Very few people study anthropology to understand this very concept of Botho that we are here about. I think the thinking around Botho is calling us to the basic issues of who are we, where do we come from, how have we come here, what must we do to make this place, to leave this place as we found it or better than the way we found it. So I think African thinking of Botho must be linked also to African legendary, the stories of where we came from, the stories of the Matsieng, the stories of this, that, and the other, of how the different communities tell where humans have come from. Because we cannot be what we are if that is not linked to where we have come from, the journey that we have taken this far. I thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I think that the Reverend has actually answered part of the question that was asked earlier this morning. So at the back there, can we just go to your right? Yeah? And then we'll...
Hi, thank you so much for all the interesting presentations. My name's Annick Bart. I just think, it's interesting to have brought it into the Botswana context there, because I'm often asked as somebody from Botswana, why does Botswana appear at the bottom of the happiness index? Why are the people in Botswana so unhappy when they've got a middle-income country, a developmental state? And my answer is usually because Botho has broken down. And why is it broken down? It's because they have bought into the whole neoliberal system, economic and social system, hook, line, and sinker. And what this has done is raised the individual self and self-interest above the interests of the community. It has transformed human relationships into services, natural resources into consumer goods, all for the sake of profit. And also, another very important part of the whole neoliberal agenda is that of property rights. Not only land rights, but intellectual property rights, whereby medicinal plants are patented. They're even busy patenting a design on a basket here. So that whole neoliberal agenda and the whole economic system within which we work has been one of the major forces to break down Botho. And the whole, my question really is that this system has been brought in with the whole westernization, with the whole buy-in to Western thought, that self-interest where it starts with Descartes. Descartes, I think because I am, that the most important thing is the self. that has broken down. I mean, you know, Botswana, when I came here in 1974, we used to walk and leave our doors open, and now we live in prisons. But the question is, how can we actually get those information flows to go in the opposite direction? Instead of always the Western thought coming in here to Africa, isn't it not more important that we start, even though we have to re-find it here, is that starts to go, the information flows need to go the other way, and people in Europe and the Western world need to rediscover what it is to live in community and put community first.
Thank you. And if you bring the mic just down to the man in the front here, and then we'll go there, and then I'm coming to the other side.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed my time here. It's pretty excellent. Thank you for all your presentations. But I wonder, at what point can we start moving our dialogue away from the thesis and the antithesis and to the synthesis? At what point do we start evolving in that direction and work to bring down the very things that would like to see eliminated from amongst ourselves, the caste systems we've created? At what point do we give up our titles? At what point do we bring down the borders? At what point do we stop using our passports? Mm-hmm. At what point do we eat in the same tent when we are here?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then...
Thank you. I wrote this so that I can be short. I was reminded today of where our focus goes is where the energy flows. And thank you, Ms. Theo, for talking about the positives about what's going on. When I was at graduate school, I was always concerned about the DSM, and I'm like, where's the book of wellness? We have a whole list of what's wrong, but we don't know what wellness looks like. I think it would be wrong especially for people who are not from Botswana, to be here and not hear about what Botho looked like in 1976. In 1976, our elders, our grandmothers, and our grandfathers, they all crowdsourced. We had an initiative called Motole Motokomu. Everybody a beast. Whatever that beast was, it could be a chicken, a goat, anything. And that's how we build our university. It didn't matter if you had a child. It didn't even matter if you had a child who you thought would make it to university. That's how a lot of these Botswanas that you see here were educated back in 1976. So how can we do it? We've done it before, so therefore we can do it again. Ms. Theo asked the question about a system. What kind of system do we find ourselves operating in that perpetuates the wounds that some of us as therapists see? I'll tell you an instance in Botswana where we have families living in different districts, like 10 hours away, 14 hours away. Husband is working in Maung, wife is working in Zabong, and they only see each other like maybe 3 times a year, I don't know, during the school holidays, that kind of stuff. And when you hear it's all about productivity, we need people, we need teachers in Kasane, so therefore you're going to Kasane. And we, regardless of the fact that you've got a family, so we have been breaking families apart. And then we wonder why children don't have positive role models. That's just one of the systems that I get to deal with in the therapy room. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, can we, the mic right next to you, yeah.
Thank you, finally. My name is Landa from South Africa. I wanted to touch on what you, Mamu Theo, and Tatu Mandaza said. about the communities, about the trees, and everyone having their role. Now, I was raised by my grandparents. My parents, unfortunately, couldn't do that. But what I learned early on in life, grandparents and the elderly have got a very important role to play. I used to engage in dialogue a lot with my grandfather. And one of the things that he said to me was, I look at life and I ask myself, what will my grandchildren not forgive me for? So that for him was a very important philosophy in terms of teaching in terms of growing me as a young person, growing others within the same space. Now my question is, what are we doing in terms of linking our children, our nephews, our nieces to the elderly? How do we then go back and form those linkages to wisdom? There is no other way to get out of this rut but to get the elderly people involved so that they can teach us how to exist and how to live, because wherever we go, we are representatives of our families, of our communities, and of society at large. So we need to get them back into their rightful place so that they can teach us how to be human first. Thank you.
Thank you. And staying on that side, that side.
Hello, my name is Refilwe, and I just graduated from college. My first question is to Yuri Hassan, and it's, given the different tribes, races, and genders, and nationalities, and so on, how do we find a way to establish a common ground? Like Mandaza described a big tree of life where different communities were working towards one big tree of life, and how do we do so while maintaining our own diverse identities? How do you think humanity is ready to use Botho in trying to understand why people do what they do, or how they live? Do you think we can achieve that level of consciousness that says, I won't try to impose my ideals or try to change you, even though I don't agree with how you live? Okay. And my other question is to the system. It wants us to think individual, strive for individual needs and wants, and take care of oneself and our interests. How do we go about practicing Botho and showing compassion in an environment that measures success as one achieving their own goals and acquiring for oneself, and putting a lot of focus on developing oneself and disregarding everybody else? How do we practice Botho?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to give the panel a chance to respond to some of those questions and comments. We will come back to you. So please, we'll go 1, 2, 3.
Me too.
Sorry, Michael. Yeah. Back.
Reverend, I'm very impressed, Papa. I've never come across a church minister who speaks on behalf of where we came from, where we are, and where we are going. That is where exactly African people started to be disconnected. That link was powerful. And to hear a church minister speak the way you are speaking, Papa, you are being inspired by our ancestors. Thank you so much, Papa. I just wanted to comment on that one day. It's beautiful.
Okay, so I will try to answer. It's a beautiful question, and maybe I can link it to the last comment. If you really think about the past, the present, and the future as a wave, there is dynamic, there is a flow. So in order to keep us all connected and still all unique, there is a dynamic that you need to practice. And I think what we learn from Mandaza, or what we learn from Buddhism, is if you practice the right way and simply have compassion and openness and humanity, and agree that we're all the same, then you can open this dynamic and be unique while still be connected. And if you practice other terms that try to segregate and say, I am because I'm suppressing someone else, that's also something that we see in humanity, and that will lead to the opposite thing. So it's not depends what you are thinking, it really depends how we treat the other. And this is something that, we need to agree as a society, and we need to establish the rules of how to be civilized, right? So it's something about the community to decide and practice. And it's difficult because we see other forces that push us to the other direction all the time, especially in these days. And it's up to us to decide what is acceptable and what is not.
Thank you. Carsten, or were you not? I thought you were waving.
No, I was just alerting the fact that there were so many excellent questions that I was feeling that my brain could not keep track of all it. So indeed, what we're doing now, I think, is wonderful to address those.
Fine.
There's maybe one little thing that I want to say. We have been talking, and I started out earlier today and ended with that also, that groups do a lot of bad things. And we fight, and we compete, and we create war. And at the same time, I think that it is important to also realize that, and that is not to say that war and conflict does not have very important negative consequences, and it's very wasteful, and it can create memories that continue for generations. And at the same time, if we think about day-to-day life, we operate in groups, we work in groups, we grow in groups, and many, many, many times this goes very, very well. Groups coexist next to each other. So in a way, I think we can cherish that and also realize the fact that oftentimes we are very well able to live in our groups, in our communities, without fighting the others. And yes, it happens once in a while. In my lifetime, I'm very fortunate. I have never been in any war. I have never been affected by anything like that. And I'm very fortunate. But I'm also not the only one.
No.
And I think that gives hope. And of course, there is the memories, and I use in my science the memory of the war by eliciting and talk. I should not talk about the Germans. But so it can perpetuate for a long time. And at the same time, I think there are so many examples of prolonged peace and coexistence among groups. And I think we can also learn from that and put hope from that.
Yeah, thank you. Michael and then Jimpa.
Right. Thank you. I'd like to link the suggestion made by our journalist here, the radio announcer, and then the sister there. I think the two questions are linked because we're talking about synthesis, the dialectical, moving away from the confrontation and binary to solutions. And she talked about neoliberal attitude. And these are all linked somehow. And it's actually a problem that is fraught with the challenges we have, especially the youth. How do we get the youth to get interested in Botho? How do we move from theory to practice? Someone talked about practice. And I want to refer to the student who talked about practice today. In culture, history, philosophy of culture, we talk about, let me speak in a jargon, then I explain. Say goods are internal to practices of a community. What this means is that what we do, the ethics of our morality comes from the way we do it in a very layman terms. Now, the challenge we have, why we can't do that and how we can do this is in two ways. First of all is we have moved, as she said in 1974, the doors were open. We moved from I am because we are, or I am because you are, to I am because I have. So I am no longer a human being. I have humanity. So notice the distinction. So I am means that I'm a human being, which means I am, naturally. But now what defines me is BMW, be my wife, you show it to girls and they'll follow you all over the place. Or the education I have, I'm educated, Cambridge or whatever the case may be, then people respect you, as you say, the elitist. People begin to see you with the vision of the possessive identity. So you move away from the way we look to see a human being. In my culture, indigenous society, it's not about the money you have, but are you helpful to your elders? Are you altruistic? Are you compassionate? This is how we measured people who were good people in indigenous societies. You want to marry a woman, you have no money to pay lobola. Your father-in-law will tell you, okay, this farm, you see this farm, you go and clear it to show you have enough energy to take care of your wife. He doesn't ask you to bring 100 cows or 50,000 cows. He says, can you work to feed my family? Your family say yes. And so we moved away from being human being to having humanity. And so this is where, from what we assimilate from the new Hollywood, from the Western world, oh, I have the most expensive cell phone. And that becomes a locus of definition of who I am as a contemporary African. Now, how do we do it? We need to redefine what does it mean to be an African in 21st century. Civilization, colonialism, westernization has come, modernity has come. They're not going away. They will make new cell phones every day. So the question is, how do we balance being an African in today's world, material world, with the temptation to define ourselves only as subject of materialism, defined by what one of my professors mentioned called technophilia. We have to redefine what is it to be a good African. And that's what Papa Tutu said in his book. He said, they said the Western world said I am because you, I think therefore I am. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, no, in Africa we don't say like Descartes. Bishop Tutu said, I participate, therefore I am. So he actually already made a distinction between I think, therefore I am. If you read his book, he said, I think, therefore I am. He said, in Africa, we don't say that. We say, I participate, therefore I am. This is actually the core of Tutu's humanism. And so we need to redefine being a young person growing up in Africa in a material world. How do we recapture the image that even if I don't have a BMW, I can still get married tomorrow?
I'm sure that that's true. Jimpa?
Yeah.
Actually, Michael kind of said it. I was going to pick up on that. But one thing that I, as someone coming from outside, now living in the West, brought up in a traditional Tibetan society, one thing that I would like to caution is to not to be trapped in false dichotomies. I take your point about being cautious of not driven by the neoliberal kind of, ideology and the values that comes with it. But on the other hand, as an Asian man who grew up in India, but now living in the West, there are certain things that the West got it right. And just because we are Asians and non-Westerners should not blind us from acknowledging that fact. The concept of human rights, the equality of everybody in the eyes of the law, the respect for the dignity of the individual, to the point where the government even cannot encroach beyond a certain boundary when it comes to the individual's dignity and right, unless there are some very powerful mitigating circumstances. Those concepts, I see them as deeply ethical and moral principles that have had powerful positive impact. And this is one of the reasons why Western Hemisphere has, after the Second World War, been a very peaceful, stable world. That is a fact. At the same time, there are certain things that comes out of that drive towards individualism that tends to have excesses, which breaks up the bonds, which makes individuals living in society quite lonely. And each individual is expected to create a meaning of their own existence. There is no sense of belonging. All of this are also consequences of that kind of moving towards individualism. And those traditional societies like Asia and Africa should watch out. So I want to caution against kind of a false dichotomy of not falling into the trap of communitarianism and collectivism, because there are models of collectivism in East Asia, and they're not attractive. Because the problem with collectivism is then who makes the decision that is the collective's interest? It ends up being a ruling elite, the people who have the power, people who have the vested interest. So then they end up treating the individual citizens in a very condescending manner. We know what is best for you. We are protecting you. And in the name of protecting so-called social harmony of the society, all sorts of oppressive measures are justified. Mm-hmm. That is an extreme of collectivism. So ideally, young democratic nations like many of the African countries like Botswana would learn from the historical experiences of both East and the West, and find a way to avoid the extremes and create some kind of synthesis that is really appropriate to the cultures and traditions here. And so I really want to caution, because it's not a question of either or. You really need to find a middle way.
Thank you. So we'll have another round of questions. Can I ask all of you to please try and be really concise so that we can get as much in as possible? So over on the other side there, and then the person, can you come down the front a bit and give the mic over here? So first over there, then we'll come down here.
Hello. So my question and comment, it's always mixed because you always end up giving a back, is when we focus on Ubuntu, we always move to the we and the collective and how to better the community, but it starts with the individual. Who is the self? What is making the self tick? Ownership of the concept. So every single person in this room should be able to say, what am I doing every single day of my life to better myself as a person, and to acknowledge when I've done something wrong and I've done something right and I've helped, so that you don't repeat the same mistake, repeat the same pattern. And that's where the problem is, in my view, and from the experience that I've had with this concept of Ubuntu and Botho, that we don't really focus on how do we make identity work. In psychology, we call it identity work. Who is this person? And how do we make this person better? Especially children. You reprimand children about so many different things, but who is this child going to be? And how do we make this identity of this child better? Because that will, in effect, help the community, the group, and etc. So, yeah.
Thank you. Do you have the mic in the middle there? Yeah.
Hi. So I just want to sort of come back to this morning's discussion, because lurking underneath all of it was this issue of nature versus nurture, that somehow we biologically determined to act in certain ways between each other. And one classic example that we all face is the one between men and women, that somehow we learn men's brains are different to women's brain, and maybe that's why they act in the particular way they do, because they can't help themselves. They don't have enough oxytocin, or they have not enough dopamine, or something that determines them to be that. And I think what modern science also gives us is, in fact, the way out of this, because what is perfectly clear, as we heard, we've got plastic brains, we can change, and increasingly the science is telling us that there's not a male brain, there's not a female brain, there's a brain that is a mosaic of many aspects which we would call male or female. And so I think science got a bit of a knock this morning, but science also can start to give us solutions where we are not biologically determined to act in particular ways, but we have this plasticity. And in terms of the particular issues that you were talking about, violence on women, that men don't have to act like that. And what the brain sciences are increasingly tell us is that we do have a mosaic brain. It's not male or just female.
Thank you. Can you pass it behind you? Yeah.
Hi. I've been thinking a lot about the coffee date with Trump. So Michael was saying he wants to have coffee with Trump, but Trump doesn't want to have coffee with him. And Yuri was saying he doesn't want to have coffee with Trump. Which one you have to draw the line somewhere, instead. So, and one can understand why.
And they had a lot of coffee together, by the way.
Yeah, we will have coffee.
I mean, the reason is that you don't want to be associated. There's a certain an association. But I think the meeting point, or the place of meeting, is really of interest to us. We're looking at our own groups, but where do we meet and how do we meet? And last night during the movie, quite a few of us laughed when the camera zoomed out and we saw that the artist was George Bush, who was painting the Dalai Lama and talking about him. And him freely associating with George Bush, and also earlier in the 80s with the East German premier speaking very highly of, I think Willy Brandt was his name, saying what a wonderful person he was, and that he has this openness and friendliness of association and meeting. And in the moment of meeting, I mean, that's where, for example, we can have the proximity. So one of the three possibilities of joining is there, and the coupling, because listening and hearing, the brains can start coupling to form some connection. So when we meet with other groups, which can be, as Carsten was saying, through war or sports or art maybe, And I think also your analogy of the German football team is the problem there wasn't the Germans, but the football. Get rid of the football, and I think there would be a lot less animosity in that example. And I'm not just saying that because my parents are German, but the question that I would like to ask Thupten Jimpa, with your 30 years with the Dalai Lama, if there has ever been a situation where he has not wanted to meet with somebody, or where he has refused a meeting, and on what grounds that was?
Okay, I'll take 2 more questions and then we can come back up here. So the mic is there, and then can you pass the mic back to this person here? Oh, you've got it, okay. And then we'll come back to you.
Hi. I'm going to talk about the I that the lady spoke about as well in Ubuntu, Botho Ubuntu. Because as a community, before we become a community, there is an individual, and then another individual, and another individual. And so my question is then, where is our own responsibility? Where do we come in? Where do we have the choices that we make that would then participate in creating Ubuntu in the community? And that is within a village, within the workplace, within the schools. Where do I bring my Ubuntu?
Thank you. And then down here.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm a white South African from South Africa, obviously. And I was born into apartheid South Africa. And I just want to say that I think I felt a little bit like the rat in Rebecca's experiments that was watching my brothers and sisters being beaten and oppressed. And I feel this urge to say sorry. And more than that, I feel extremely privileged to be here listening to your wisdom. And I don't ask, I beg that you send this out to the world, because in my view, it is the most important thing that we need in our world. I really say this from my heart. I went and I found my solace in Buddhism, and I'm amazed at the similarities of the compassion aspect. And I just can't believe what I'm hearing from my African fathers and mothers, and I beg you to please help us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so one in the middle here and one at the side here, and then I'll open it up to the panelists.
Oh, okay.
Keep going.
So thank you. My name is Annemarie Pieters. I'm also from South Africa. I'm from an organization by the name of Humanities Team. So Team for Humanity. Our core principle is we are all one. And in 2005, when we started the movement in South Africa, I knew immediately that this oneness, or this integral approach that they are talking about out there in the world, is our Ubuntu. I really believe as Africans, we have always known what it truly means to be united and to be one. But I just want to share quickly something that in my advocacy work around Ubuntu, I recently sadly realized that Ubuntu is no longer written into the Constitution of South Africa. There was a time that it was written into the preamble. And one day, as I was advocating for the call for a National Ubuntu Day in South Africa, somebody said, no, but Ubuntu is not written in the Constitution anymore. What I want to say is, we talk about colonization and how easy it is that we give up some of our most precious things. For me, Ubuntu is our most precious spiritual heritage, and we have given it up. It's not written into our constitution anymore. It's not just the words that is not there anymore. When we take that word, Ubuntu, when we take that and dissect it, we learn so much about it, what it means about us as human beings. And I'm begging that, and I will do anything I can to make sure that the word Ubuntu comes back into the Constitution of South Africa.
Thank you. There's someone there with the mic already. Yeah. Oh, and then
so what I wanted to say is thank you very much, and I wanted to draw on what Mandoza said yesterday in terms of focusing on the inside. And Yuri, when you did your presentation today about meaning, I was like, okay, I can choose how I view Arthur. So meaning isn't just something that exists on what I hear. It's actually a choice that I have in terms of what meaning do I ascribe to something. It can either elicit emotions to me that bring me towards you, or it can elicit to me anger that pulls me away. So in that way, I actually have a sense of ownership above how I am, and that's what Jinpa was saying in terms of compassion. Let me choose a meaning in life to things that happen to me that actually result in compassion. And I think what you were saying, Jinpa, in terms of having an overarching system, I was just reflecting on the thought that I don't follow rules unless I understand them. And I think in terms of dialogue, I'm not able to participate in dialogue until I feel compassion for another. And I feel that that's why it's so important to bring it into early education. How do we teach our young children how to have compassion? And in the same way, what the lady over there was saying, how do I look at myself every day and look at, am I choosing meanings that generate compassion, or do I choose meanings that generate anger? And if we think that maybe compassion is something that can be taught, then Carsten, if this oxytocin is something that really has a biological effect, then why don't we focus on the Palestinians where we saw no impact? Why don't we maybe do something like a meta-meditation before we do a study like that and see whether we can override the effect of our biology through education? For example, doing a meditation with the same subjects or different, not the same ones, a different group, and then bringing it in.
Because wait, one more question, sister.
Actually, maybe mine is not a question, but more of a comment about this issue of I. I think what I find is a problem with us Africans is we want to feed our stuff into what is expected of us. So whatever I do, it has to fit into this, what is this scientific way of saying things, instead of being proud of our own and developing maybe our own research and our own science. So we want to fit it in, because when I'm listening to this I thing, and the I is, when it's very personal, it's about me and me. It's not about me in terms of in relationship with, I'm not alone, I'm not an island. And yet the African Ubuntu thing doesn't altogether say you don't exist as an individual. If you take the Proverbs, they will tell you, you shape yourself. There are some Proverbs that say a person shapes themselves. The Botswanas would know that a person becomes who they are because of what they are doing to themselves. So it's not that altogether it doesn't exist, but it's more like, it's more communal than individualistic. I think that's the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to open it up again now. There's some specific questions for Jinpa and Carsten, but the rest of you just take any of the questions.
I think Carsten was dying to respond to that question. So
sorry about it.
No.
I think it is important, if I understood your question or suggestion correctly, can we come up with a way to sort of tone down our biology, for example, our oxytocin, so that we do not see those nasty effects? I would remind you that if that's the correct interpretation, I think that you would be likely to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You might get a reduction in threat protection, which sounds aggressive. But you will also see a reduction in self-sacrifice to benefit group members. And as I said, people cooperate in groups. They are willing to give up their self-interest for the benefit of others. And it looks like oxytocin is involved in that self-sacrificial tendency to help others and help others become better, including protecting these others through, if necessary, if not otherwise possible, an aggressive act. So if you reduce that biological mechanism, you flatten it out. You will not only throw out a tendency for us to aggress others when we think it's necessary to protect, but you will also throw out our tendency to self-sacrifice and help and care for others. And I don't feel in a position to say this one, the gain here is more important than the loss there. That's, I think, beyond me to say. It also depends a little bit on the specific circumstances. So I'd be careful by, say, readily interfering with our biological system, because we may create inadvertent effects. And that's one thing, and the other, and it relates a little bit to the remark that was made earlier on the plasticity of the brain, and I think Becca might have to say something about it as well. In my studies, I have always been very amazed by the fact that I give people some little oxytocin or a placebo, and I tell them, now you think about Ahmed or Helmut or think about Gerben. And that changed their behavior, their decisions, with all the consequences coming out of that. And I think that suggests that our brain, our biology, is indeed very, I would say, flexible, adaptive. It adapts to the environment, and it sort of mediates how we as a system, as a human biological system, respond and deal with our environment. So in that sense, it is very, I would say, flexible and far away from deterministic. It depends very much on the environment, how we behave, and our biology allows us to basically do that. That's how it, but maybe Becca, you know much more about this than I do. So maybe you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a tiny bit onto that, I mean, I completely agree with that this flexibility, this plasticity that we have, this is good for us in a very broad sense. We need to be able to adapt. We need to be able to learn from the experiences that we have to, you know, to help us survive. It's when the experiences are severe that this kind of goes, the plasticity almost goes too far. And that can change in a very long-term way, the way you approach situations, the way you treat people, and that's when we get into trouble. But on a daily basis, things are very dynamic, and although you could go be a subject in one of Carsten's or Uri's experiments, and they can give you a piece of information. You're part of this group, or this is how you're supposed to interpret this situation, and there is plasticity that allows you to behave in a way that gives them their data. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how you're going to behave tomorrow. It's really, again, when these more severe experiences happen that you go into more long-term changes.
So let me add a little bit to this particular question. I think the question had two sides. One was, can through cognitive strategies like cultivating particular perspective of others and expanding this horizon of circle of concern, that you can override biological limitation? I thought that was the other aspect of the question. And I think here, I think science is not there yet. I'm not a scientist, but I've been with scientists for over 30 years now, through the Mind and Life. I've been sort of dragged there kicking and screaming because His Holiness is so interested. So I had to sort of get up to the task to do a sort of a steep learning curve. One of the difficult questions for the scientist is, because we're talking about two-way causation. From the biology to the mental is what we saw. But from the mental to the biology is a bit more complicated, partly because the whole scientific language is a material-based language. It's object-based language. It's from an outside looking at a third-person perspective. A hint of that came in Uri's presentation, because he talked about how prior beliefs, it changes the way you synchronized it. That's a kind of getting there. So I think at the moment, the question about whether or not cultivating meta to a specific outgroup, will that actually override the limitations of biology, is an open question. A Buddhist philosopher would argue yes. Buddhism holds the promise that by cultivating your perception of others, you can expand this perspective. And in a way, you can see that in His Holiness. One of the amazing things about His Holiness is that when he sits down with someone, there is a total sense of ease in His Holiness, that here is a man who's totally comfortable in his body, because he's able to relate to that person in front of him, regardless of whether he knows him or her, at this fundamental personal level, human level, spontaneously. That's the first instance of relationship and impulse comes from that level. And when that happens, it's very beautiful. The fact that he could do it, at least holds the promise for all of us that we could do it if we learn. So that's what I wanted to kind of add to this, because there's a sort of a two-way causation question, and it's more complex. There was a specific question to me. I have had the honor to serve His Holiness for over 30 years now. I've never known a situation where he would refuse to meet someone. Of course, as a leader of the Tibetan people, there are a lot of protocols, so it's not just easy for anyone to just turn up and say, I want to meet with the Dalai Lama. But beyond those limitations of protocols and time and all the rest, he, on his part, and in fact, he says that when he meets someone, whether it's a politician, a president, queen, just an ordinary person, there's no difference for him. What matters to him is the genuineness, authenticity, and the heart of the person in front of you. And this, I think, is a beautiful example that you could do it. And when you can do this, you can see there's a tremendous sense of freedom in this human being. There's a kind of a sense of abandon. Because there's no hidden agenda, there's no self-agenda. He's free. What you see is what you get. And it's a beautiful example, which at least for me as a practicing Buddhist holds a promise that if I try, at least the example is there. Thank you.
And on that note of authenticity and freedom, we're going to bring this to a halt because we do need to leave the university for their own security reasons. Just to remind you all, please, if you can, to join the Arts Festival this evening, which would be wonderful, and to remind you that tomorrow, Vusi Mahlasela, I've got a terrible accent for his name, who is just the most wonderful musician, will be doing a full set of music in the afternoon. So it's a really wonderful opportunity. And we look forward to seeing you all here again tomorrow morning. Thank you all very much, and thank you to all of the presenters. Thank you.